Genethics, the ethics of genetic engineering. Come on in here, says Jenny to her husband Rob. What is it, Rob? Says to his wife Jenny. We need to pick out what our baby will look like. Do we have to do that now, says Rob to Jenny. Yes, we have to do that now because the doctor told us that we have until Saturday to pick out what our baby will look like. And that's 2 days away. Okay, so what are our options? Well, we can pick the gender, we can pick the hair color, we can pick the eye color, and we can even pick whether we want an athlete, a genius, or someone who's musically talented. And the best part of this Pick Your Baby software is that the doctors told us that with a little bit of extra money, we can eliminate all chances of diseases for the baby. Breakthroughs in genetics present us with a promise and a predicament. The promise is that we may soon be able to treat and prevent a host of debilitating diseases and afflictions. The predicament is that our newfound genetic knowledge may also enable us to manipulate our own nature, to enhance our muscles, memories, and moods, to choose the sex, height, and other genetic traits of our children, and to make ourselves better than well. Instead of cherishing the gift of an individual, God-given child, people are beginning to treat their children like online characters. When science moves faster than moral understanding, as it does today, men and women struggle to articulate their own needs. In liberal societies, they reach first for language of autonomy, fairness, and individual rights. But this part of our moral vocabulary is ill-equipped to address the hardest questions posed by genetic engineering. The genomic revolution has induced a kind of moral vertigo. The origin of genetics traces back to the 1850s in Charles Darwin, one of the earliest and most famous people to ever challenge the idea that Christianity and science are inextricably linked. Darwin believed that all animals came from a common ancestor, and through a series of natural selection and macroevolution, slowly evolved into the enormous variety that we have today. This view has caused people to challenge the biblical teachings of creation. Around the same time, a scientist named Gregor Mendel began to experiment on breeding pea plants. Among his discoveries, he was able to create his laws of inheritance. And several years later, these laws provided the foundation for a soon-to-be-named science called genetics. More and more scientists began to research this brand of science, which led to the discovery of deoxyribonucleic acid, also known as DNA. Frederick Michner discovered this, and DNA was first modeled by James Watson and Francis Crick. They discovered that DNA is the template for every living organism on the planet. Scientists believe that this is possibly one of the greatest discoveries ever. In this DNA, there are things called genes that are the sole reason that organisms develop the way they do. In the following years after the discovery of DNA, chemists worked on developing techniques for both the sequencing of nucleic acids and proteins, along with determining the relationship between them, which is the genetic code. Over the years, as we learned more about this cutting-edge field and that the regulation of gene expression can be controlled, a subfield called genetic engineering emerged. In genetic engineering, the DNA is modified to alter the traits and change the abilities that organisms can perform. In the past couple decades, scientists have mainly focused on large-scale projects, such as sequencing entire genomes. This relatively new field has only been around since the 1970s and is arguably one of the fastest progressing fields of science that we have today. Consider a boy who goes to his closet and pulls out a 6-foot-long crate of Legos. He prides himself in how his parents are willing to buy him any set that he wishes to have. He can build anything from a small house to an entire life-size castle. This is the same issue that geneticists face today. They have an endless supply of biological Legos at their disposal, which they can use to enhance, create, or modify living organisms. With such incredible knowledge, we are faced with a huge moral dilemma. Is this creation and modification of creatures against God's will? Are we as humans showing our attempts to usurp the Almighty Creator? With all of the modification of creation to our liking, is there a point where God would say, stop? In my humble opinion, genetic engineering does have a moral limit. Genetic engineering is the science of modifying and altering genes to control an organism's traits, features, and abilities. A moral limit is a place where we, as humans, have to analyze our human bounds regarding God's creation. There are 3 reasons why it is essential that we determine a moral limit for genetic engineering. First, somatic genetic engineering, which is engineering on non-reproducing cells, yields positive results such as reversal of lost muscle mass in cases of muscular dystrophy and aging, and in memory loss in cases of Alzheimer's and also aging. The second argument is that God created this world the way He intended it to be, and germline genetic engineering, which is genetic engineering that affects all cells and causes effects to be passed down hereditarily to offspring, is essentially humans deciding what is best for this world instead of God making that decision. And lastly, as most good things in this world, genetic engineering has a dark side, in that some potential side effects of it can yield world-changing results. These arguments all serve to display the limits of genetic engineering and to counter the ideas that the proliferation of germline genetic engineering modification in humans is a good thing. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He created light and darkness, land and sea, plants and animals, and lastly, humans. He created us as humans to have dominion over His creation. Genesis 1:26 says, "They will reign over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, the livestock, all the wild animals on the earth, and the small animals that scurry along the ground." Shortly after this, Adam and Eve sinned in the garden. This is what caused human nature to be fallen. So, man is now imperfect. When man decides to modify other man, this is an imperfect being modifying another imperfect being, therefore only increasing the imperfections. allaboutpopularissues.org, a blog on genetic engineering issues, made a great point in saying that man would simply become another man-made thing. When used for somatic engineering to fix broken God-given things, though, genetic engineering is okay. The moral quandary is when people use this to become beyond health and therefore superhuman. In order to grapple with the ethics of enhancement, we need to confront questions largely lost from view. Questions about the moral status of nature and about the proper stance of human beings toward the given world. Since these questions verge on theology, modern philosophers and political theorists tend to shriek from them. But our new powers of biotechnology make them unavoidable. To see why this is so, let us consider 4 examples already on the horizon: muscle enhancement, memory enhancement, growth hormones, and reproductive technologies that enable parents to choose the sex and even some of the genetic traits of their children. In each case, what began as an attempt to treat a disease or prevent a genetic disorder now beckons as an instrument of improvement and consumer choice. Each of the above examples has a valid, moral, and good use of repair, and a possible negative side effect, and a moral implication usage for enhancement purposes. As far as muscles, most people would gladly welcome a gene therapy to alleviate muscular dystrophy and muscle loss, which is resulting from aging. L.H. Sweeney of University of Pennsylvania developed a gene that actually reverses the muscle loss. But shortly after he finished his research, athletes had already called him about getting into this program. Why exactly is the idea of genetically enhanced athletes bad? A gene-enhanced athlete is comparable to a drug-induced one, as far as unfair advantage. But then again, naturally, some people are more genetically strong in certain places than others. This creates a class of superhumans who will forever be stronger and more athletic than regular humans, and their offspring will also have the same genetic traits as them, as overly strong people. And so, as far as memory, recent research is showing that memory genes can be synthesized to create photogenic memory in rats. These genes would be great for repairing people who have Alzheimer's. This would also be great for natural memory loss from other conditions such as age. Likewise, to muscles, memory suffers the same end. This, if used for non-remedial purposes, once again would create the subspecies of genetically elite people and genetically normal people. As far as the issue of height, human growth hormone has been approved for use on children who have hormonal imbalances which make them significantly shorter than average. This, once again, is an example of a fixing part of God's creation that upon entering this broken world became broken itself, and so we should fix it. But when this is used on healthy children, which the FDA actually recently approved the use of HGH on boys who are 5'3" and below, and girls who are 4'11" and below. And so this causes a similar issue as the previous examples of creating a hierarchy between humans. Michael Sandel, a prominent researcher on genetics, said it best. Some oppose height enhancement on the grounds that it is collectively self-defeating. As some become taller, others become shorter relatively to the norm. Except in Lake Wobegon, not every child can be above average. As the unenhanced begin to feel shorter, they too might seek treatment, leading to a hormonal arms race that left everyone worse off, especially those who couldn't afford to buy their way up from shortness. Is this scenario troubling because the unenhanced poor would be denied the benefits of bioengineering, or because the enhanced affluent would somehow become dehumanized? As with muscles, so with memory. The fundamental question is not how to ensure equal access to enhancement, but whether we should aspire to it in the first place. However, somatic engineering evades this dilemma, as it is just like any other medical treatment that it fixes the other issue at hand. And as far as the issue of gender selection, people can determine the gender of their children. Processes such as ultrasound were invented to screen embryos so that ones carrying disease genes would not be selected. These same processes can be used to determine the gender of a baby. This example has no redemptive aspect, and that is entirely against the natural order of birth, and that society would have more opportunity to become sexually imbalanced. For example, China and India both have chilling numbers as far as male to female ratios, and gender selection possibilities only support the idea that for male-dominated societies in these countries, as we see today. Using genetic engineering to repair things for therapeutic means is, in my opinion, okay. Using genetic engineering to enhance things is what's not okay. When people use genetic engineering for the purposes of enhancing man or designing babies, which is essentially trying to create better people than what God has created, and therefore diminishing man by making man into another man-made thing, people are overstepping their bounds, similar to the incident in Genesis with the Tower of Babel. The point of the tower was for man to elevate himself up to where God is. And by manufacturing people or altering man, man is trying to elevate himself to where God is, similar. And in each case, man could take science too far, to the point of where you could expect God to intervene in a noticeable way. So, what have I covered so far? First, I argued that somatic genetic engineering yields positive results. Second, I argued that God created this world the way He intended it to be, and that with germline genetic engineering, we are beginning to go against that. And lastly, as most good things in this world, genetic engineering has a dark side, and that some potential effects of it can yield world-changing results. These arguments all serve to display the limits of genetic engineering and to counter the ideas that proliferation of germline genetic modification in humans is a good thing. Now, some people might oppose my ideas and say, well, God gave us this world and tells us to have dominion over it. And so, why should we have to put a boundary on what we do scientifically? In response, I would have to ask a series of questions. The first of which being, well, didn't God put the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the middle of the garden, but said, do not eat of it? Can't we relate the tree to germline genetic engineering? God has placed a magnificent thing in front of us, in easily accessible space, but are we to mess with it? Is it possible that this field in science is simply a hypothetical garden, and that there are many similar parts of this field of research, but there's this one part that we are not to venture to? God gave humans dominion over creation. We have dominion over animals, and so we are allowed to engineer these animals and plants within reason, as our dominion provides us with rational judgment on the matter. But we should not modify humans, as we, being equals, do not have the discernment to know what is best for humanity. Only God knows that. T.D. Jakes, a renowned pastor, said it best. There is a higher power, a higher influence, a God who rules and reigns and controls circumstances and situations that are beyond your area and realm of authority. Man should also not modify other humans, because man, in modifying other humans, is becoming another man-made creation, and therefore diminishing life. As James Weldon Johnson, an old African-American preacher, said in one of his sermons, young man, your arms are too short to box with God." But Jesus spake in a parable, and he said, "A certain man had 2 sons. Jesus didn't give that man a name, but his name is God Almighty. And Jesus didn't call these sons by name, but every young man, everywhere, is one of these 2 sons." Some others might propose the question to my thesis that if we can use genetic engineering to come up with a solution to the memory loss of someone's grandmother with Alzheimer's, who's to say that we can't use the same treatment on a husband who frequently forgets his anniversary, or him and his wife's child who frequently leaves his books at school or forgets to do his homework? And so I would have to respond to this. Or even another question that someone could ask is that, what about the family that has 2 kids, but one is a normal height and the other one has a hormonal deficiency that makes him short? Why should the short one be getting treatment and not his brother who wants to be a professional basketball player? Germline genetic engineering violates the right to autonomy by choosing a child's genetic makeup in advance. And only by doing this, parents deny the child's right to an open future. A similar objection can be raised against any form of bioengineering that allows the parents to select or eject genetic characteristics. According to this argument, genetic enhancements for musical talent, or athletic prowess, would point children towards particular choices, and so designer children would never fully be free. All of these issues come down to issues of creating dichotomies between the rich and the poor, and therefore the genetically elite and not. Also, an issue is proposed that not everyone can be genetically elite, as when everyone is elite, then the word elite becomes the norm, and yet the unenhanced would still be at a lower class. And so then anyone who still has the money left would become better than elite, and therefore continuing a never-ending loop of genetic enhancements, and therefore creating hierarchies between humans, and increasing dehumanization as hierarchy climbs. This essentially makes certain humans better than others, which is bad, as all humans were created equal. But then this ties us back to the idea of God not giving us a good enough child. This is dehumanizing to the rich who can afford genetic engineering, and discouraging the poor who can't afford it. In our quest to learn more about genetic engineering and the modification and alteration of God's creation, people lose sight of what we are and were created to be, and become psychological matter. Professor Julian Savulescu, an ethics professor from Oxford University, once said, "Genetically screening our offspring to make them better is just responsible parenting. Creating so-called designer babies could be considered a moral obligation, as it makes them grow up into ethically better children." With these people out there, the danger still exists of breaking the moral bounds of human modification. So, just to recap, I argue that somatic genetic engineering yields positive results. I also argue that God created this world the way He intended it to be, and that with germline genetic engineering, we are beginning to go against that. And lastly, I argue that as most things in this world are good, and as most things good in this world have, genetic engineering has a dark side, and that some potential side effects of it can yield world-changing results. So what do we need to do as good Christians? I realize that Christians do not always like to do this, but we need to get ourselves into the world of science and start to bring up such issues for debate. Christians often see and hear evolutionists and Darwinists and stand in the background complaining about how scientists are causing the secularization of the people, but then they don't take any real action. Christians need to be at the forefront of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, so that the unavoidable moral implications can be managed from a Christian perspective, in contrast to being driven by factors such as money or greed. Getting into some public debates with the foremost non-Christian geneticists would also be a major step in the right direction for the ethics of this field. Creation is a magnificent thing. We are encouraged by God to explore and learn more about it. We as Christians must be careful to avoid certain parts of science that may seem amazing, but could be against God's original intent for man. Not everything that looks good is good. In the modern age, we are faced with issues of their grave nature all too often. Scientifically, we make the mistake of doing first, but thinking later, which may eventually contribute to God's disapproval of our advancements in science. When we begin to change the magnificent world around us to be better in our eyes, we might just so happen to be making it worse in God's eyes. So with all of this in consideration, I believe that God must have given us genetic engineering to assist in countering the effects of the fall. But when we use this power to take the liberty of trying to fix or trying to enhance other things, we are violating God's original intentions for his creation. Thank you.